Hi, this is Melissa Barnes, and this is week 2 of EDF4004, Assessment and Learning. Now, first we're going to talk a little bit about feedback for enhanced learning. Feedback is increasingly getting more and more attention in regards to, what as educators we need to be doing, providing more feedback and quality feedback, so that balance between quantity and quality. Now, I think all of us as students could say, of course, the more feedback we can receive, the better, but it's not just about more feedback, it's about quality feedback. And then from the teacher's perspective, it's making sure that we have quality feedback, but that we have the time to do so, because we obviously can't give tons of feedback all the time, because it could be very time consuming. So how do we give that feedback in very valuable ways? Now, feedback is often associated with assessment for learning or formative feedback. So you'll hear a lot of F's here. So feedback and for learning and formative assessment. So that's one way to remember it. But the thing is that feedback is not necessarily just in those particular, for those purposes. It can be associated with any kind of assessment task, whether it's formal, informal, summative. So it's important to understand that feedback can be used in different ways, and it may look different, but feedback is an important part of all assessment tasks. Now, there's been research done in regards to feedback, and not surprisingly, Hattie found that one of the most powerful factors influencing student achievement was feedback. So feedback can be powerful in influencing student achievement, and obviously feedback can provide and encourage learning, but it ultimately can improve student achievement. So here's the question: can good assessment encourage learning? Now, I would say yes, but I think the important thing to remember is that, or to consider is, what is a good assessment task? Assessment tasks aren't easy to create, and a lot of times it takes a few goes to get it right. And that's why I always encourage trialing your assessment tasks when you actually create one. But I think a very good assessment task would encourage learning, because that should be at the forefront of any creation of assessment tasks, is that will this encourage learning? Will my students learn from this? Oftentimes we see assessment as such a separate thing to teaching and learning. It sits somewhere else, but actually it's a very integral part of that teaching and learning process. And it should be encouraging learning, and it should be informing teaching. So assessment tasks should encourage learning and inform teaching. And that's a really, really important thing, is that assessment doesn't sit outside. It is part of, a regular part of the teaching and learning process. Assessments need to happen often, and it needs to be an integral part of every classroom. And as we'll talk about more, assessment is not just about teacher assessment. It's being able to critically evaluate oneself and others. Feedback also helps students understand, when they're given feedback, students understand where they are, where they've been, and where they are heading. And this is a really important part of being a self-regulated learner. And if you can be a self-regulated learner as a student in a classroom, you're probably going to have relatively good skills to go out into the workplace and be able to evaluate and say, okay, well, this is what I know, this is what I don't know. Now, how do I get to that point where I feel knowledgeable about what I don't know? So that's an important part, and that's putting ownership on students. Now, I hope by now you have read Baude's short article, do note it's short, article on feedback. Now, he looks at feedback from two perspectives, and there's kind of the basic idea, the one that most people think of with feedback, and that is information provided to students has been taken up and has led to desirable change. Now, the interesting thing about feedback is that information is provided to students. So students are the receivers of information, and then they decide whether they are going to take it up or not, and then they change. The second view that Baude has is the responsive view of feedback, and that's where learners are active agents in seeking and using information from a variety of sources. Somehow we get this view that teachers are the only ones that can give good feedback. Now, sometimes it's the easiest way to give feedback in a way. I mean, it's not the most practical in regards of time, but teachers are they're control freaks. I mean, I'm a control freak in a lot of ways, and we feel, oh, nobody could give the feedback like I could give feedback. So a lot of times teachers in particular think, well, I give feedback and I give it in this way, and then that's how they learn. And students pick that up, and then students think, oh, well, I only want teacher feedback. I can't get feedback from anywhere else because the teacher knows. Now, if learners are active in they're assessing themselves, and they're being able to use a wide range of information sources to be able to provide feedback on where they're at. Now, Bowd on page 5 says the requirements for effective feedback that encourage learning are three steps here. Knowledge of appropriate standards or criteria. So what standards are being assessed by, or criteria? Now it's comparing one's own work with these standards and then being able to take action to close the gap between the two. And it's ensuring, and that's where kind of this idea of scaffolding is, making sure that students then have the skills to be able to close that gap. But students are the ones that need to actually acknowledge the standards, be able to compare and evaluate their own work. And that's an important word, is evaluate, being able to critically evaluate their own work instead of waiting for someone else to do it for them, and then taking the action to then close the gap. Now this brings us nicely to self and peer assessment. Now a lot of people have differing views about self and peer assessment. Either you've used it a lot and you love it, or you go, no, students don't like it, I don't really like it, I think it's just a waste of time. But surprisingly, research says that there are some benefits of self and peer assessment. Some of these, and I'll let you read this, I won't go into too much detail here because it's in your book, in your textbook. But self-assessment, and first of all, provides an opportunity for critical reflection. So it's not just kind of, oh, what did I do? But it's really kind of unpacking and picking at those sorts of things about what students have learned and what they need to learn and so on. Self-monitoring, it goes back to that self-regulation, being able to kind of say, here's where I'm at, this is where I need to go, oh wait, I don't understand this, what do I need to do? And it puts it puts it back on the students that it's their responsibility to kind of, self-monitor their own learning, which that equips them to be much, lifelong learners. It's going to prepare them to be much more efficient, in real life scenarios. So a better understanding of strengths and weaknesses. I know you probably don't think you have any weaknesses, but sometimes it's good to be able to identify what you're good at and what you need improvement on. And again, it's assuming responsibility. So it's taking responsibility for your own learning. Peer assessment is a bit of a funny one because some people go, oh, it makes students uncomfortable. They don't like giving feedback to others. But I would argue that particularly if you look at social media, students love to share. They love to share what they're doing, endless selfies, so on. And they love to be critical of other people. Now, obviously, it's not a negative thing, but actually a lot of times peers do enjoy getting to see different perspectives and going, oh, I didn't think about doing it that way. That's really interesting. So not only is there ownership of their own assessment, they have to take ownership of their own assessment, but they get a wide range of feedback and different perspectives. We often think that teacher perspective is the only one that matters, but actually it's very limited in what kind of, feedback they can give. It's just one teacher. But peer assessment, they get all these different, kind of views. And it's a critical appraisal of work. So it also not only for the one giving feedback, the person that's getting there, the person giving feedback also has to kind of critically think about how they're going to assess and evaluate. Collaboration. Peer assessment provides that kind of, we work together, and that's an important life skill. And finally, and I think this is really important, is clarifies assessment criteria. Sometimes we read, for this unit we'll have some rubrics, and you'll look at it and go, okay, yeah, I totally get it. And then sometimes you get something back and you go, oh, is that what that meant? This kind of reduces some of those issues because they, students actually get to play with assessment criteria a bit and see actually what does this mean with an actual assignment, or assessment task. The other benefit of self and peer assessment is that teachers can learn a lot about their students. They see how they view themselves and what motivates them and so on. So not only is self and peer assessment a good opportunity for students to take ownership of their learning, but it's a good opportunity for teachers to actually sit back and see their students from a different perspective. Now, Brady and Kennedy talk about the essentials of self and peer assessment, and they say that it's promoting the value of reflection. As teacher educators, you have learned and constantly hearing about the value of reflection in teaching, and the same is true for learning. It's also setting targets and goals, whether it's individual or as part of a class, getting students to set targets and goals, developing explicit criteria for what they're going to be assessed on. And Brady and Kennedy give a bit of some information on how students' involvement in developing and implementing peer assessment. Now, peer and self-assessment requires practice. Students never feel 100% comfortable doing it, and some are really critical of themselves or others, but the more that they practice, the better they understand the assessment process in general, and that's an important and a very valuable skill. Again, Brady and Kennedy have a sample self-assessment strategy on page 83 that I would have a look at as well. Assessment and reporting, the wider audience. Now, so who are the stakeholders in regards to student assessment? Who are the stakeholders that actually care about how students do on tests? So obviously they're students, they care how they do. But the question, the more pressing question to ask is, will what they've learned, or will this assessment encourage learning? Will taking this test help them learn anything? And how is it reported? Will they actually learn anything from how it's reported? Teachers. Now, for example, in the US, they have incentive programs and funding based on how well students do on tests. So there's a direct link of this is important for teachers because they are responsible and held accountable for how well their students do. The interesting thing is that a lot of these incentive programs are based on student scores and how high their score is. They often don't focus on how much students have improved, which shows that there is some kind of problem in how we look at learning. Is it about being at the top, or is it about learning, the process of learning? Now, I would argue that education is about the process of learning, and it's not about just, there are some people that are just naturally very good at taking tests and they're just very, very bright. There are others who are extremely bright, but they don't do well in tests. So there's all these sorts of things to consider, but teachers are accountable for these sorts of things. And while we don't have incentive programs here in Australia, there is this pattern that keeps on pushing more and more accountability for teachers. So hopefully this won't become part of Australia's education policies. School leadership. So schools, I don't know, I drive past particularly private schools and you see this big sign that says, oh, so-and-so got 99.5, on the VCE, or, and they announce this. And so obviously schools want to say, hey, look at us, we're doing amazing things. We have bright students and we are responsible for this. So schools want to be, and particularly with things like my school, they want to be ranked against other schools and be one of the leaders. The larger community, and some of you might think, well, what does the larger community care about how well students are doing on assessments? Well, good school equals increased house prizes. And this may sound a bit odd, but I find it really interesting here in Melbourne that you have communities that have a really good public school, or a public school that has done well and ranks high in my school. And all of a sudden, what happens? People go, oh, well, it's much cheaper to go to public school than go to private school, so I'm going to move here. But then the house prices are crazy. So the community, every community wants to have a good public school because a good school equals increased house prices. Now, there's another group of people that are also very important stakeholders in regards to student assessment and reporting, and that's policymakers and OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, OECD is in charge of PISA, which is all 15-year-olds, I believe, take it, and it's every, might get this wrong, 4 years, I think. And it gets a lot of media attention, and it's the who's who in education, who's doing well and who's not, who's the biggest loser. So, but why would an economic and development organization care so much? Well, it's because there's this very strong idea that an educated society equals economic productivity. So if our students, if we have a population that is educated, it equals economic strength and productivity. So it's in our best interest to have an educated society. There are some issues with this idea, which I will go to next. So what influence can student assessments have on the broader community? I've mentioned a few, but if you think about things like My School, it ranks schools. Now this creates like a marketplace for parents. Parents want the best for the children. I have 2 children, I totally get this. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, I have to be going to the best school. My child, who is, probably the most important child in all of the world, that's what parents think, needs to be at the best school. So they're looking at these schools and they're saying, oh gosh, this is a bad school, this is a good school. Now, those scores do not necessarily sum up the school, but this is what's kind of happening. And then we kind of see, oh, what's a good neighborhood and what's a bad neighborhood? Where do we want to go? Where do we want to be? And you're creating this kind of divide in a lot of ways just from this, student assessments. Now, again, a lot of media attention happens with PISA, the PISA and NAPLAN, and then policymakers kind of go, oh, our nation is getting dumber. We need to worry about this. So they freak out and they create all these policy reforms because they think, what's going to happen? We're going to be, we're not obviously economically, strong, and we're losing our spot in the, this global marketplace if we're not doing well on the PISA. So all of a sudden they're freaking out, they're doing all these sorts of things, and oh, now we need to be accountable for this, and all teachers have to take this test because we have to have teachers because it's their fault that students aren't doing well, and so on. So you create this sort of thing. Now, tests aren't bad, and student assessment and knowing about student assessment is not a bad thing, but I think it's knowing that it's one just part of the picture. Because what types of tests are we using? We're using traditional tests, standardized tests. Standardized tests are limited in what they can test. And by nature of a standardized test, they need to be efficient and practical. And if they need to be efficient and practical, that really does limit what they can measure, because they can only measure it in a certain way. You're not going to have a lot of performance being measured. You're going to be measured in a very, there's one clear answer. And there's one right answer. And that doesn't necessarily sum up knowledge. Knowledge isn't about just one right answer all the time. So the question is, what is being tested? And the nature of these tests is that while it's great that they're testing certain things, it's not the whole picture. And who decides, what is being tested? We talk a lot about basic skills, and making sure we have basic, literacy and numeracy skills. But again, is there, what about problem solving? All these sorts of things. It's based on a traditional test. So that's always something that we need to consider. All right, that's all for now. Enjoy your word tutorial, and we'll see you next week.